Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Malcolm Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium. It's Tuesday, January 25th, 2022, and this is our second week of programs that feature faculty, postdocs, visiting scholars, and graduate students from around the University of Idaho. This is the first of three programs featuring members of the Idaho Society of Fellows, a new postdoc program in the College of Letters, Arts, and Social Sciences, and more on that in just a minute. But before introducing today's speaker, let me tell you a little bit about next week's program. We will hear from Ken Udis, who is the Vice Provost for Digital Learning Initiatives, has been at the University of Idaho only a few months, and is going to share his thoughts on digital learning here and globally. And his title is The Art of Being Fashionably Late. But you don't want to be late for his program. It will start promptly at 12:30 on February 1st. So hope you will attend that program. And today's program, as I mentioned, features one of our new class postdocs. Joe Feldman is a postdoctoral fellow based in the Martin Institute in the College of Letters, Arts, and Social Sciences. Joe, before coming to the University of Idaho, was an assistant professor of anthropology at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. His research has focused on memorialization of political violence in Peru, which is the subject of his first book, Memories Before the State, Post-War Peru and the Place of Memory, Tolerance, and Social Inclusion, published last year by Rutgers University Press. Currently, he is developing courses in peace building and Andean studies at the U of I, and working on a new research project that centers on social inequality and political culture in Peru. His topic today is populism, progressive elites, and the notion of the caviar left in Peru. So please give a warm vandal welcome to our class postdoc fellow, Joe Feldman.
Great. Thank you very much, Kenton. And thanks to all of you for attending. It's really great to be here. And Kenton, would it be possible to, I don't believe I have access to the sharing function. Right?
Of course, you should be able to share starting now.
Oh, okay. I don't see the icon.
Might just take a minute for you.
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah, sorry for. Oh, there we go. Yes, perfect. Okay, so let's. Okay.
Looks good.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for bearing with me. I'll get right into it. This notion of caviar left is a key term, a key word in Peruvian political culture. It has been over the last couple of decades. And really some possible translations of this term that might come to mind are words or concepts like limousine liberal, maybe a bit antiquated, champagne socialist, perhaps more common in the UK, but I think we're familiar with forms of name calling like coastal elite or latte drinking liberals. So those translations maybe give us a sense of how this term is used. But what I'm going to put forth to you in this talk today is that, or maybe what motivates my research on this idea is that we need to maybe look a little bit closer and look at some of the specific features of these kinds of constructs and try to situate them within political and economic histories. So I'll just go ahead and read my argument because I tend to be a little bit more I tend to write a little bit more clearly and concisely than summarize it. So this examination highlights the way Caviar comes to refer to the pursuit of wealth and influence through an embrace of progressive ideals and projects, as opposed to merely pointing to a correspondence between social privilege and left political views. This focus on benefiting responds to Peru's uneven development and recent experience of political violence, but can also be understood as a reconfiguration of class relations and inequality that is characteristic of populist political styles around the globe. And I'll say more about what I mean by that. Engaging with scholarship on the place of progressive elites and right-wing populist formations, we suggest that attention to the meanings surrounding figures like the Peruvian Caviar offers opportunities for understanding the role of normative ideas of wealth, inequality, and social mobility in contemporary populist appeals to the people. Okay, so that's essentially what I was trying to put forth there. So a bit on the context of this work. I'll say a bit, it's maybe a classic case of something, in the context of a different research project that catches your attention. So as Kenton mentioned, my dissertation research was focused on this National Memorial Museum initiative that was oftentimes described as a kind of caviar institution or infiltrated by caviar. So it was kind of a recurring term in my previous research, and I thought, oh, maybe someday I'll write something about that. I was also interested in sort of recurring debates in the U.S. and in Chile that really brought these intersections of social privilege and activism to the fore in important ways. And so I think it went from being something that was struck me as interesting and curious in some ways to being a theme that I think is rather urgent and important. And I think recent political developments the last 5 years or so in different parts of the world and sort of crises of related to political polarization in Peru have made this topic of sort of name calling and labels and categories and politics not just interesting, but important and perhaps urgent in some ways that I didn't initially envision when I was first exposed to this term. So I'm in the process, and really my time at the U of I has been critical for developing this into more of a research project, which I could talk more about that would sort of extend beyond this particular example. And I'm planning to do some future ethnographic research involving interviews, observations, and sort of work on the ground in Peru, hopefully this summer if conditions permit. So these are things I'd like to talk about and maybe taking some of the limitations or responses you have to this presentation, thinking about that work moving forward. So today I'm going to focus more narrowly on right-wing uses of this specific term, caviar. And this work comes from, just to note that this is based on an article manuscript that I've co-authored with a former student of mine, Francisca Moraga Nunez, is at the Catholic University of Chile. So briefly on kind of the basics of what we're referring to with this term, this can refer to politicians and public figures, sort of members of the political class as such, but it can also refer to, and I would say very commonly refers to people working in NGOs, government agencies, people working in areas of human rights, university professors, artists, and activists of different kinds. And so a point that I'll make, and this becomes analytically important in some ways, is that many caviars, people who are labeled caviars, aren't sort of elites as such, if we're referring to kind of economic and political elites. These critiques mostly come from the Peruvian right or the sort of right-wing sectors, and certainly the terms emergence and popularization is associated with the right. However, and I'll just set this aside for now, left-wing uses of caviar have become increasingly prominent in light of recent political developments. Peru, and I think that in many ways, those are very interesting to think with. But again, for reasons of sort of coherence, I'll focus more on right-wing uses in this talk. And so really the thrust of caviar critiques or caviar discourses is to draw attention to this intersection of privilege and advocacy and some of the contradictions that might emerge as a result of that pairing, sort of the social distance between the populations advocated for and the advocates themselves. So I won't spend too much time on kind of historical background. I think that, and the paper I'm basing this on has some attention to that. However, I'm also sensitive to the risk of over-contextualizing in the context of a relatively short presentation. So just in terms of the term itself, Caviar Left becomes popularized during the early 2000s. We can trace this to the works of blog authors and very specific individuals, and sort of taking off in right-wing media. And so the term is a localization of French term gauche caviar. Curiously, about my understanding of the French term is that it sort of emerged within the left. However, in Peru, we find a different story. And so just some brief, and again, I don't want to overwhelm anyone with historical background on this, but I think some developments relevant to understanding the caviar phenomenon or this or caviar discourse as a phenomenon include Peru's experience of political violence, country experienced an internal armed conflict in the 80s and 90s, and so some of the rhetoric surrounding, which centered on the Maoist Shining Path insurgency and state responses to that group. And so a lot of rhetoric surrounding left elites in Peru and really the left in general is framed by that context. And just a note on the authoritarian government of Alberto Fujimori between 1990 and 2000. There you see him pictured in the upper right when he implemented a self-coup or carried out a self-coup in 1992. And so while the term caviar didn't really exist or wasn't really widely used in Peru during the Fujimori era, we can see a lot of elements of this rhetoric kind of targeting NGOs, targeting political opponents, members of the political class, critiques of human rights organizations, and the like, emerging during that period. And then into this century, following the transition, there's an effort or a series of efforts aimed at addressing the history of the political violence, among them Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And really much of the last 2 decades, we've seen the kind of backlash against narratives of the political violence that essentially seek to present that period more as this great triumph over essentially Maoist terrorists, so and caviar's emergence really as popularization can be traced to that kind of period of backlash, the transitional justice initiatives, Truth Commission, and also a high point that scholars have drawn attention to is the 2007 extradition of Fujimori to be prosecuted for human rights crimes. And so rhetoric surrounding caviars really picking up during that period. So despite the term's prominence, there really hasn't been a whole lot of scholarship on the notion of caviar left. We do have a number of commentaries, perhaps kind of shorter op-ed pieces of, in some cases, intellectuals commenting on again, the implications of caviar, critiquing the concept. So the late Peruvian sociologist Gonzalo Portocarrero described the authoritarian tone of caviar discourse and critiquing it as a way to discredit a range of actors. Others have taken the approach more of dispelling myths, of kind of asking the question of how much do these NGO workers and human rights activists, gender equity, how much are they really making at these positions and so on, and also question, is it really a problem that people are essentially getting paid for work in areas of social justice and so on. And then we have also interesting, and this could be a whole an entirely different presentation, just focused on kind of satires, sort of interesting reappropriations of the term among those it purportedly describes. And so there's even things like you can find a caviar meter online and enter in different features and see how caviar you are and so on. So thinking about the term's appearance in existing scholarship, it's often kind of addressed in passing, and in my own book I do this as well, but as kind of translated as champagne socialist or some term, with the assumption that this is kind of a generic category. It's more or less legible. If we know what coastal elites are, if we can think of analogous French terms, we more or less know what's going on with Caviar Left. And so I'd say, at some level, the thrust of this work, or what motivates me is that sure, there's a heuristic value in referring to progressive elites as sort of a comparative general category. However, there's something to be gained by looking closely at specific terms and uses and their uses. So I won't go too much into how I'm thinking through this comparative significance of this work and its potential relevance to debates about populism more generally. And it's sort of axiomatic to say that populism really, or one could say that almost definitional to populism are these people elite distinctions, sort of politicians and other figures presenting themselves as representatives of the people in the face of kind of corrupt elites and the likes and the like. However, scholars have drawn attention, thinking about particularities of contemporary waves of populism. Scholars such as Cass Mood have drawn attention to the way that maybe with contemporary populism, we can distinguish specific ways in which groups become defined as either people or the elite. And so scholars have drawn attention to this transformation that has taken place, where we have a lot of classic populisms, railing against billionaires and current incarnations of the 1%, and so on, with more of that focus on economic elites, whereas contemporary Populism and Mood is writing in the European context, refers to this reaction against progressives and the politically correct in contemporary populism as being an important feature to draw our attention to. And actually, despite commenting on Europe, focusing on the emergence of that within American conservative debates of the 1970s and 1980s, kind of railing against the new, so-called new class. And so to get into the the notion of kind of how Caviar might participate in this sort of what we're referring to as a reframing, reconfiguration of inequality, I found, and just to kind of give a shout out to one work in particular, really some insights from media studies and messaging to be rather useful. And so Reese Peck's recent book, Fox Populism, looks at the way in which, again, this notion of elite and these sort of people-elite distinctions has been configured in ways that really look at class more as a cultural, educational formation, as opposed to thinking about just sort of wealth, income, and so on. And so examples that could be used would be like the emergence of terms like job creators, positioning CEOs, business owners as part of a noble laboring class, in need of protection. And the way that sort of notions of elitism have been transposed in a way or used to refer to things like values, as opposed, even in situations where differences in wealth and income might be marginal or even non-existent. If we think about examples such as small business owners versus school teachers. I think many of us working in higher education routinely encounter this perception that we make a lot more money than we actually do, and so on. And so this sort of reframing of inequality, again, kind of focus more on certain types of actors that might be viewed as politically correct, progressive, and denigrated in those ways, being key the analysis. So thinking about these issues comparatively in Peru, scholars, political scientists have drawn attention to these what has become referred to as neoliberal populism or neoliberal populist formations, which is it might at first glance seem to be a kind of oxymoron. However, thinking back to a period of rise of neoliberalism in Peru, or implementation of neoliberalism Peru in the 1990s onward, we have analogous or sort of parallel efforts to sort of reframe the issue of inequality, which continues to pose a kind of structural constraint for the right in Peru and other Latin American nations. So scholars have drawn attention to phenomena such as how this celebration of informal capitalism in Peru has been a way of creating a sort of new notion of who is the average citizen, who is the person that is sort of deserving of certain rights and protections, and thinking about this as more kind of cultural images that emerge, like the emergent cholo, the cholo entrepreneur, cholo referring to kind of an urbanized indigenous person, as being a construct that has been key to understanding the sort of ways that right-wing actors have had this sort of populist messaging in a time where at first glance, economic policies have not necessarily favored addressing inequality. And so interested in the ways in which that image exists as a way to appeal, consistently is useful to appeal to kind of an average citizen, a kind of heartland in contemporary Peru. And so working with this kind of caviar, professional managerial mobility, benefiting small-scale informal entrepreneur distinction as something that interests me more from an analytic standpoint. So thinking about how to track these more in a more empirical or systematic way, really, I initially was interested in taking more of an inductive approach. I was always interested in this sort of sense of the term that related to the theme of benefiting. And we proceeded by looking at just sort of how the term was used, how caviar and its variants, whether it's sort of caviarizarse or caviarón, and so on, how they appeared in language. And so we used articles published in 3 Peruvian newspapers over a period from 2015 to 2018, and just kind of pulled paragraphs where caviar or some variant appeared, ended up with, treating each one as a case, ended up with 609 in total. And we use text analysis, techniques associated with text analysis. And so looking for every theme we had, using 2 coders, assessing intercoder reliability and resolving cases. And so something we're using, I'm happy to talk about, limitations of using newspapers as a database, or newspapers as a kind of material. It's certainly an imperfect corpus in many ways, but a point that I'd like to make in the context of this presentation is that I'm really not offering a media analysis as much as I am just looking at linguistic patterns that that are widely shared in Peru. So initial set of questions, again, we've got all kinds of interesting findings regarding even just kind of use as an adjective versus verb, and these kind of grammatical and semantic features. I've got a next slide on word frequencies that I think are just kind of fun and revealing in some ways. But we looked at factors like gender, race, region, get a sense of the caviar profile that emerges. And so there you can see 44 instances of male caviars, 31 female. However, caution against viewing that as if this is a kind of gender neutral term. We have attacks on caviar feminists specifically. We have depictions of the suspect masculinity or heterosexuality of male caviars, which kind of follows patterns that we can see elsewhere in the world. In terms of race, ethnicity, region of origin, we find ways that caviar is not, by definition, a limeño, someone from the coastal capital, but Lima is very prominent in these narratives as sort of oftentimes represented as a site where people become caviars. With regard to race and ethnicity, there's tends to be very little sort of direct or explicit references to race and ethnicity in sort of Peruvian media sources. However, we can find some findings showing, we have some findings showing this link with whiteness, and which again elaborates on kind of histories of exclusion, both kind of Peru as a whole, but also within Lima. And so I just included this because I think word frequencies can be fun to work with, but there you have, so you have Fujimori, likely referring to Keiko Fujimori, and I could, whose name came up in interesting ways in the data set, but there you see words like rights, and so human rights kind of going together. Vieran is a reference to the mayorship, left-wing mayorship of Susana Vieran. And PUCP refers to the Catholic University of Peru, which I'll be referring to shortly. And so just to talk a little bit more, so I was always interested in this benefiting theme, and so I knew I wanted to do something with this, and my interest in it related to some of my experiences in Peru, talking to people, and just a sense of an interest in the way that caviars were oftentimes depicted as obtaining wealth and benefits through embracing or for advocating for progressive causes, links with particular types of institutions. And again, kind of the way that caviar in some cases, might be focused more on this contradictory correspondence of, oh, isn't it kind of funny and weird that you have these relatively privileged people taking on these left-wing positions. sort of the sense that became more interesting to me, and again, kind of reflecting my own experiences in the US and places like Chile, was more just this notion of, oh, maybe it's not a coincidence. Maybe people, you know, acquire or maintain their status precisely through their involved, or there's that perception that people are maintaining that status precisely through adopting certain political views or taking on certain issues. And so this a sense of benefiting appears in really the earliest definitions or expositions of the or on the caviar concept in Peru in sort of early 2000s. It would be very difficult to exaggerate the prominence of these themes in discussions surrounding transitional justice and the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So you have people becoming accused of, you know, making money off forensic investigations in Ayacucho, or people, sort of claiming that, forced sterilizations, investigations of forced sterilizations during the Fujimori government, that's just another thing that the Caviars invented to enrich themselves. These kinds of statements or claims. And so I want to, and it's extreme variance, obviously we can sort of debunk and dispel myths, but at the same time, like any sort of representation, it's not as if these are wholly invented notions, or these perceptions kind of respond to some, some sense of reality. And so just to say that, there are obviously people who make decent salaries working in fields of transitional justice and human rights, environmental advocacy in Peru. And I would say a non-trivial percentage of them might come from relatively privileged backgrounds. However, something that I really want to, and again, for analytic reasons, I think it becomes important to emphasize this, is that there's a sort of moralization of different means of acquiring wealth and paths or sort of modes of social mobility. And so this juxtaposition between a kind of mobility that is more a kind of professional, managerial, middle class existence. So a lot of the Caviars are just sort of college educated urbanites, working in offices, right? They're not necessarily occupying the highest echelons of society. So that sort of professional managerial mobility versus that of the emergent entrepreneur, sort of the figure archetype I referenced earlier as being something that becomes important for understanding the cultural significance of benefiting as a phenomenon. So in order to go about tracking and kind of thinking through these, let me just make sure I am, okay. Yes, so thinking about that theme is interesting, but it's another thing to go about trying to track it or substantiate what I'm saying, based on the material at hand. And so, again, using these text analysis techniques, I thought it would be interesting to pursue something of a kind of content analysis, hypothesis-driven tests of these different or kind of different possible themes. So I did it in relation to kind of this juxtaposition or comparison of the theme of class origin versus benefiting as they appeared in these 609 paragraphs. And so for the theme of class origin, we had annotators, research assistants, again, who weren't really, who we didn't tell them, the hypothesis, specific hypothesis. being evaluated, but we had them code for class origin. So in this case, relevant indicators could be things like private secondary schools, growing up in wealthy districts, being from well-off families. And so, we'd find this in the material through terms like caviar aristocracy, caviar bourgeoisie, caviars as pitucos being a term that points to intergenerational wealth, status. And so we also had, a few things that were kind of in the close but no category, like, attending a private university wasn't, or a prestigious private university, or studies abroad. It was kind of close, but we didn't count that in our annotating. And then we had the benefiting theme that I've talked about, in a more abstract way, but we had to operationalize it. And so benefiting had to refer to this action, or more accurately, the perception of this action, where people are benefiting, receiving economic or political benefits from their embrace of progressive causes or advocacy for those kinds of views. And so within that, the mere possession of wealth or power wasn't significant, it wasn't sufficient, to code it or allow it to be in that category, being something that was almost definitional to Caviar Left. And so also we used progressive and caviar, those terms, as in a fundamentally relative way, sort of in the context of a particular paragraph. And so some of the identified caviars, we didn't really worry too much whether they were actually caviars according to some external definition of that term. So just to give a sense of, a finding that I still think is rather interesting, that we see benefiting as a theme comes up as being more than 3 times more, it appears more than 3 times more frequently than class origin as a theme in this data set. And so this really tends to support, it helps us feel a little bit better about the notion that caviar, again, can in some cases mean that there's this wealthy person who happens to hold progressive views, but not necessarily, perhaps points to a lot more than that in most cases anyway. And so an initial way that I started to analyze or make sense of this. And I'm still interested in this, but we have to go through peer review, and sometimes we get called out on some of our claims and comparisons. But an initial way, it was kind of thinking about contrasts with the U.S. and the way that historically, the limousine liberal, for instance, wasn't necessarily the idea that these people were wealthy because they adopted particular views, and in fact it was oftentimes according to historic works, we have Steve Fraser's book and the like, oftentimes more this, like, on the one hand pursuing sort of capitalist wealth accumulation, and then adopting liberal progressive views in one's personal life. And we could say the same thing for figures like coastal, kind of modern day coastal elites, that we don't necessarily think of them as being elites because of the fact that they have certain views or are activists and so on. So that's kind of still sort of interesting to me, but I'm also sensitive to the limitations of such a comparison. I mean, if we think about 70s critiques, conservative critiques of the new class, they would be making arguments that were really quite similar to 21st century Peruvian commentators, pointing to kind of the self-interest of professional managerial liberals. On the left, you can find interesting critiques nowadays of the so-called nonprofit industrial complex. In terms of and I think even just in a more colloquial, everyday sense, I think terms like wokeness sort of point to the way that people, right-wing uses of the term wokeness can kind of point to the way that different actors might be trying to benefit or have certain kind of economic considerations in mind as they adopt certain views or values. And so the comparison's interesting, but I also am sensitive to the way that it can divert attention from the way that there are these entrepreneurial producerist logics kind of thinking about Reese Peck's work on kind of reframing of class relations and inequality, kind of how that sort of that comparison that would place benefiting more on the Peru end and class origin more at the US end of the spectrum, how that might hinder the development, kind of seeing some similarities across cases. And again, a unifying theme being this moralization of sources of wealth, modes of mobility, and the like. So I can go pretty quickly through this just to give you a sense of, I think going through institutions is a way to hit at that, at some of these ideas in an effective way of this focus on kind of non-entrepreneurial entities and people benefiting. And so you have these are from the data set, Caviar, the state as a baby bottle, Caviar infiltration. NGOs are incredibly prominent, but also linked to the state in some ways, because NGOs are typically receive public contracts or government contracts and people working in consultancies. So you have Caviar NGOs hunting for public funds. You have Catholic University of Peru being very prominent as kind of the heart of the Caviar system. And also there's these ties to kind of Caviar's inauthenticity, superficiality, the idea that they're engaged in this kind of cynical pursuit of benefits and that they're not really even leftists or that they're kind of former leftists who sold out. There's this category of Fuji Caviares that points to people who are involved in some way in the Fujimori government, who later, sort of rebranded themselves as being human, defenders of human rights and activists and so on. And then it's more extreme variants, and I haven't really developed this part of the work as much as one could, but I think it's related to this, of where you have this way that the Caviar discourse can morph into these kind of conspiratorial ways of thinking. And so, links to Shining Path, terrorists in quotes, being sympathetic, that was a theme that we tracked. And then most recently, again, kind of an online campaign, Catch Your Caviar campaign led largely by Fujimori supporters that, again, as a phenomenon can at least point to ways in which this sort of speech, this rhetoric can potentially have implications that are quite violent. And so I'll just conclude here. So Caviar Left, so I've tried to illustrate as ways that this refers to a set of actions in many cases, as opposed to simply an entrenched class, role of institutions, state agencies, NGOs, universities. Association with Lima and whiteness, generational wealth is significant in this construct, but far from absolute. There's ways that the term really can encompass so-called new caviars, and even individuals from working class backgrounds who aren't from Lima who become involved with these sorts of concerns. And so I'll just conclude with the conclusion of my paper. So our analysis centered on right-wing uses of caviar emphasizes how caviar discourse advances a reconfiguration of class rhetoric that is shaped by decidedly Peruvian characteristics, legacies of racism and Lima-centrism, the glorification of informal capitalism, and the demonization of anti-capitalist terrorists among them, terrorists in quotes. This reframing of inequality, evident to some degree in right-wing populisms around the globe, elaborates on particular notions of class, race, and social mobility, and seeks to evoke an appeal to mainstream citizens. If an emerging anthropology of populism is to productively engage with the denigration of progressive elites as a key issue, comparative attention to how figures become defined and conceptualized to how such will be essential. Cases like the Peruvian Caviar offer an opportunity to study disparagement as a process that is rooted not only in political and economic histories, but in the mobilization of cultural normative understandings of inequality and notions about how wealth and status should be acquired and maintained. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Feldman, for a provocative and informative presentation. And I know we have a very informed and engaged audience, and Professor Graydon has raised his hand. And Dale, you may have the first question.
Thank you. Great presentation. Thank you very much. I have several points, but I'll just stick with two, and then we'll continue over lunch later in the week. In the 1990 election, Mario Vargas Llosa loses a huge number of votes because he goes up into the countryside and speaks French. And you know, I don't know when that formal word of caviar comes into public discourse, but I would suggest it is clearly in the minds of a whole lot of folks in the countryside. If it's not the word caviar, it is, this guy is an outsider, he's an elitist, he's trying to impress us, and he truly doesn't represent our interests. And you know, you might want to consider that as one of the first chapters, because then the journey of Mario Vargas Llosa from being a supposed liberal to his scathing denunciations of Hugo Chavez and the Cuban Revolution. So from the left-hand side, he becomes, you know, this caviar intellectual, international intellectual making opinions about supposed progressive, you know, revolutionary environments. So it's just one thought. The second one that comes to mind that I do want to mention also is in this last election, I think Keiko Fujimori had a hard time putting the finger of caviar against Pedro Castillo, because he's clearly coming from, you know, indigenous countryside poor roots. He's a school teacher. So my sense is, and I think he used that against her. My sense is, if not formally, it's certainly understood. So I guess my one little comment would be, from the right wing, I feel like that word caviar quickly expands into other terms like, you know, socialism, subversion, communists, etc. So the power, I guess my conclusion, the power of these words and these terms is just extraordinary. And I find your research very interesting. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dale. And I again, we'll be able to continue the conversation over lunch. And I see there's other people with their hands up, but just briefly, I think your observations regarding Vargas Llosa and Fujimori in that period are very critical and relevant. And I think, you know, we always kind of have that tension between, you know, are we doing a history of ideas, or are we doing more of a grounded, you know, history of a term or kind of specific terms as they're used. And I think that, yeah, I think that moment, that period is so vital for it, because Fujimori was effective in appealing to the masses in ways that Mario Vargas Llosa, for, you know, the reasons you described, is it being unapologetically ethnocentric and so on. So Fujimori was able to, yeah, tap into sort of mass support in ways that Vargas Llosa really never could have. And so I think that yeah, I think that that's very useful to think with. And then with your second point, and I'd say that in Fujimori, the term was cívicos, and a lot of people have looked at like cívicos as being a sort of a predecessor to Caviar, right? Or if we're looking at and Fujimori as railing against the political class, and not, Fujimori wasn't against, unlike a lot of or sort of a previous generation of leaders that might be thought of as populist in sort of the neo-populist way. You didn't go against the oligarchy or like sort of that older, you'd go against the political class. And so kind of consistent with observations that scholars of contemporary populism have highlighted. And I think just to answer your second point, to respond to your second point briefly, the answer is Pedro Castillo, the way that some actors on the left resist categorization as caviar is very important. However, and so Pedro Castillo, nobody could successfully peg him as a caviar. What the issue, and this is an important footnote in the paper, and something that the broader project will look to address, is that really for right-wing commentators in Peru today, you have essentially left-wing critics or left-wing actors are essentially either, or this classification is sort of a two-part, either caviars or they're terrucos, which is a sort of Quechuaized term of referring to people as terrorists. And so people who might, come from the highlands, attended public universities and so on, they're subject to a practice that has now become critiqued as el terruqueo in Peru, sort of terrorist baiting. And so Pedro Castillo and people in his administration, they receive that a lot more than the caviar accusation. And in fact, and I alluded to this in the presentation, Pedro Castillo and his allies love to rail against the caviar leftists who might be taking over his government, and or there's those kinds of concerns left. So yeah, so it's there's kind of this all-purpose way that the right way, it's like if they're not a caviar, you can label them a terrorist, essentially.
We have a hand up from Professor Stuen. Eric, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'm an associate professor of economics in the College of Business and Economics, and but I'm thinking back to 20 years ago when I had some time before graduate school and spent 3 months in Peru, and had a homestay with a middle-class family in Cusco. And what I was thinking about was how I don't recall, experiencing caviar as any part of Peruvian culture. So it seems to me that average Peruvians would view it as very foreign. And I'm wondering if there's like a strain of xenophobia or a connotation of xenophobia associated with it. That may be part of the slander. I'm wondering if you looked at that. Yeah.
Just a brief clarification. You refer, like when you said caviar as being very foreign, are you referring to the food caviar?
I'm talking about the food, not the term, right? But
yeah,
if it seems not just an elite kind of food, but also a food that's not Peruvian.
Yeah, and so this is actually the opening paragraph to my piece, and maybe it's it's not really effective, but yeah, I did sort of just kind of out of curiosity, and it's something that be interesting to maybe do a little bit more work to look more into. But no, I mean, the short answer to your question is yes. I mean, precisely because it's foreign and there isn't really much caviar in Peru. You can get it, there's like a few high-end places where you can get some imported Uruguayan caviar, but Peru doesn't have it. Peru doesn't have a caviar industry to speak of. There's huevera frita, which is sort of like a fish roe that is fried that people have on sandwiches, and that is like sort of more of a working class, something that people would eat in Callao. But but yeah, I think the foreignness of caviar is certainly relevant, and I think that I'm of the opinion that these sort of the metaphoric and symbolic uses of terms and the actual things, it's like they do kind of blur together, like and so the food caviar in the data set, the food, I can't remember, I don't have the numbers in front of me. The food caviar appears, in a very small minority of the cases we tracked, and we included that, just tag them, and sometimes it would be the caviars eating caviar, like.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about it, like these are myths and lies that they spread, and it's all about connotations. And
and so it'd be interesting, like if I went to Lima, this would not be like a central thing, but I'd be interested in going to one of these caviar places that sell caviar and speaking to like people there about
how they feel about
coming in, are these like these left-wing human rights activists or whatever who are Anyway, but that's a great question. I appreciate it, Eric. And yeah, I guess it bears mentioning that probably when you would have been in Cusco, it would have perhaps been before this term took off, in its contemporary usage. But also, I mean, something that's interesting to think about is how the term travels and is maybe used in different ways in different parts of the country, right? And so I think that I don't know, for instance, how common it would be to refer to like elite Cusqueños or, using these kinds of terms. That's probably not very likely. I think the association with Lima is significant.
Well, and there's so much less of a like Asian presence in Cusco too, and the mountain cities.
Yeah, and so I think that the foreign connotative, just kind of cosmopolitan elites in general, it's kind of this notion that they're not really Peruvian, it crops up, and that sort of rhetoric as well. So, yeah.
We have time for one more question, and we can go back to Professor Graydon. I don't see any other hands raised, so please.
Please, I'm open to anybody else. I'm not trying to cut anybody off. I'm not seeing a hand. I noticed that my French professor colleague, Professor Nelson, is here. I would like to simply throw out, maybe not the word caviar, but I love the theme of anti-intellectualism that pervades the research. And my one little comparison here north of the border is John Kerry is fluent in French, and they hid that.
Yes.
Because he recognized very clearly that just ain't the message for the common folk.
Yep.
And that's the exact same thing I would suggest with regards to intellect, France, foreignness, outsiders, etc. As far as not carrying out efficiently a populist message. Let me put it that way.
Yeah,
anyway.
I think Kerry is, I kind of came of age politically at time, like that was the candidate when I was 18 years old. And so seeing, the French thing, the can I get a hunting license when he had that speech, that people seized on as him sort of trying to be folksy. And ways that, that flip-flopper as sort of this, and actually political and linguistic anthropologists have written about, that specifically because of his wishy-washy, like not really masculine, properly masculine, decisive, flip-flopper image. So I think Kerry, within the US, like John Kerry is an example that stays with me.
Anyway.
That's great observation. Yeah.
Professor Nelson, would you care to respond or comment on that prospect of French being a political liability in certain parts of the US or in Latin America?
I don't know if I have anything very revealing or enlightening to say about that. But yes, I totally agree with what Dale said. It is a thing that you should hide if you want to get elected in this country, probably, and also apparently in Peru.
Well, on that note, we've come to the end of our hour. So I hope that you all can join us next Tuesday when our speaker will be Ken Udas, the Vice Provost for Digital Learning Initiatives, and we'll be on Zoom at 12:30 p.m. on February 1st. So I see hands up already in Zoom, but if you want to applaud on screen or have a hand up, thank you very much, Dr. Feldman. It's great to have you on campus and contributing to our intellectual discourse with presentations such as the one today. Thank you, everyone, and look forward to seeing two more fellows from the College of Letters, Arts, and Social Sciences on February 8th and February 15th following the Ken Udas presentation. Again, thanks everyone. Stay well, enjoy the sunshine. See you next week.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Ken.